Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. It's Zahra from the Collapse Life podcast. I'm here once again with my good friend Susan from Courageous Conversations, and we're here for another installment of our weekly book chat. We started last week talking about a very interesting book called Reinventing Collapse by Dmitry Orlov, and so we're going to continue that conversation for the rest of this week, and perhaps spilling over a little bit into next week. But we're all in slightly different locations this morning, this evening. So maybe we'll start there, and we'll ask everybody who is tuning in with us as well. Let us know where you are in the chat. Susan.
Yeah. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I am in my hotel, obviously not home. And I can't compete with Zahra being in the airport last week, but we are roving reporters, and we're here to talk about the first two chapters in Reinventing Collapse, and to relate them to what's happening in the world at the moment, because there is so much going on, and the big questions are, what can we do about it, and how did people who went through a collapse of their empire, which was the Soviet Union, how did they endure? How did they survive? And what made it possible for them to go into renewal? Because in a very short period of time, Soviet Union rebounded it and remarketed itself as Russia, and is now an empire again, and affluent, and is in war, just as United States currently is, although it probably would not admit it. It seems to be. So we're in a world that's very fast paced, and we're wondering as ordinary people what we can do about it.
Yeah. And just as a recap for those who are tuning in, maybe for the first time. So Dmitry Orlov is someone who was born in Russia and raised there until he was a young teenager, and then his family moved to the United States. So he was uniquely positioned to be able to talk about the changes that he saw from the country that he remembered in his childhood, and then the country that he continued to see after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when he would go back to visit, to see friends, to see family, and also for business. So he traveled back there often, and you get the unique perspective when you go away from a place and come back to really feel the changes. But he was also able to understand the cultural context of those changes. So he wrote the book from that perspective, and wrote it really to show both the similarities and the differences, and to kind of be a bit of a warning to the United States of the path that it's headed on. And interestingly, as we mentioned last week, this book was originally written in 2005, so 20 years ago, and then updated slightly in 2011, but still extremely, extremely relevant. And so a really interesting read. We recommend everyone check it out if you find this conversation enlightening. But what we're going to talk about a little bit today is the chapters where he focused on those similarities. How could you compare the Soviet Union and the United States? And certainly during the Cold War, it was a comparison that most people on both sides would have rejected, thinking there's nothing that similar about our two units, our two nations. But in fact, as he lays it out, there really are a lot of similarities, beginning with the fact that they were both industrial empires, both trying to impose a particular ideology on the world, both empires that funded proxy wars and armed conflicts around the world, maybe somewhat quietly, in the sense that people didn't recognize that was happening at the time, but we certainly recognize it now. He points out the huge incarceration systems that both empires produced, and how the United States even went a little bit further by turning it into a privatized industry. And then lastly, I'll pause and let you jump in, Susan, but I think one thing that he pointed out, which is maybe not so much a similarity, but a difference, is that the US used to have a lot more goodwill around the world than the USSR did, but that gap has shrunk. And since he updated his book in 2011 to today in 2026, I don't even know if there is a gap anymore. In fact, it may have inverted now.
I would say it's inverted. I think you're being very, what can I say? If you asked a lot of people, let's put it that way, who was the evil empire, who was most disruptive, you only look at the track record of the number of countries that the Russians have invaded compared to America, or America's bombed. America wins on that score very, very easily. But I wondered, one of the things I thought was interesting is Orlov said in the book that when the Soviet was going through its collapse, most Americans would be horrified to be compared to the Soviet Union, as you said. But then writing in 2006, he said, I don't think they would feel the same. Well, I wondered in 2026, and this is the question to people who are out there, I'd love to hear your views. How do you think and how do you feel about being compared to an empire collapsing over 30 odd years ago to what's happening in America and the Western world now? We'd love to just hear your inputs and everything.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think the kinds of people who are probably tuning in to this conversation have their eyes wide open. And so there's no denying the situation that the United States is in. And in fact, there's an entire movement of people who are moving from the United States to Russia now for a better quality of life, for being able to raise their families in a place where they recognize the values. I don't know if those stories are just part of a propaganda machine or not, but we've read more than one story about families who have left the United States and moved to Russia and had good experiences from it. So, as I said, I don't know whether those are just part of the narrative control, but it's interesting nonetheless.
You reminded me, I heard that. I heard that the Russians were offering land at one point to people who came. I don't know the data on that, or whether it is apocryphal or whether it's true. But if you look, and this is what's so thought-provoking about the book. So the first chapter is he gives the Soviet examples, and he asks that big question about why did Soviet empire collapse? And he said, one was huge debt.
Yeah.
Bankruptcy, foreign aid, all of those sort of things foreign debt, I should say.
Yeah.
And the other was overreaching military expenditure.
Oh.
Huge.
Very familiar.
Yeah.
And the idea that revenues from energy, from oil and gas, were falling at that time. So couple that with the unsustainable debt, chronic deficits, the reliance on, in the case of the United States, the reliance on foreign central banks to prop up the currency. The United States is very much in a similar position right now, more so now, 20 years on, than when he originally wrote the book. And of course, he spends a lot of time actually talking about energy as the sort of hidden driver of the success of both systems, assuming that cheap, abundant energy would be available forever. And that's kind of what was able to fuel, pun intended, the growth of these empires.
In different ways. And it was cheap energy. Yeah. And he says that that's one of the vulnerabilities of America, which, anybody who's been following the sort of collapse stories and preparation knows that sort of suburban way of life is an incredible vulnerability that is not sustainable once fuel prices start to go up. And that, we said that last week, didn't we? And it's worth just repeating for those people who are new and just joining us this week, that was one of the motives for going into Venezuela, because it won't just stop there. It will be other people. And it's a typical sign of an empire in collapse, that in order to keep their population quiet, it is to make sure that they still have continued resources and particularly cheap energy.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that he pointed out as well as another similarity is that both empires completely decimated family farming. And that, of course, that food security issue is close to the heart of many people who think about and talk about collapse. Family farming was replaced with fossil fuel dependent, industrialized agriculture. That is a huge issue here. I know it's happening in Europe as well. And farmers have been protesting that in places like the Netherlands and Belgium. And so maybe you have some thoughts on what's happening there, but that's a really big one. And you know, I don't know how necessarily that has recovered itself after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it's definitely going to take a huge, huge hit here in the United States.
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've been following the food thing because it's particularly interesting and something obviously he doesn't cover in the book, but is becoming more apparent and would seem quite controversial to a lot of people, but is now becoming more mainstream, is the deliberate destruction of the food production systems and the takeover. I mean, there was one recently, and I hadn't realized that. I read about Bill Gates buying lots of farmland in America, but he's been trying to do it in the UK as well.
Interesting.
And certain people have blocked them and they brought their lawyers in and made life really difficult, but they still sort of said no. So this whole idea, and this is the industrialization of food production, so that we lose our independence and we're then dependent on these bigger systems. And obviously people like Bill Gates, who's investing in food technology and processed food and all that. So not nutritional food that makes us strong and independent, but food that we have to buy from them that's of an inferior quality. And then you've also got the seed, the chemtrails and all of that going on, which is apparently designed to destroy farmland and food production.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, there's a lot of different elements that weren't around or he wasn't aware of them, weren't included. And I don't know whether that's happening in Russia or they're making themselves more food secure. I'm guessing it's that.
Well, so next week we want to look a little bit at resistance and the people who kind of fall outside the margins, based a little bit on what Dmitry Orlov has written in this book, and then taking the conversation a little bit further. And obviously being able to grow your own food is a huge part of the self-sufficiency conversation around collapse. And he has some interesting insights into how people in the Soviet Union were able to do that, and what enabled it and what also constrained it. I see we have a few comments coming in, so let's turn over and have a quick look. Matthew Kerr-Lewis. Hello, Matthew. Nice to see you. Oh, sorry, I missed one at the top. But let me start with Matthew. Matthew says, the comparison doesn't trouble me. What does trouble me is the budget being provided to ICE and the escalation of detention centers being built. Statistics available at Christopher Armitage's Existential Republic. For Mark, is this another comment? For Mark Petrie, the Soviet Empire collapsed because there was nothing left for the parasitic class to plunder. The same is now happening in the West as parasitic capitalism collapses. That's a very good comment. Yes, thank you both, Mark and Matthew. Susan, any thoughts?
Yeah, they're interesting comments, and I agree with them to a large extent. But I think, you know, one of the things that I heard recently was, and I think it was Scott Ritter, who was saying that the mistake that Venezuela made, and also Russia is in the process of making it, is giving indications that they will that they would have done deals. Mondaro was being very placating towards Trump and saying he would work with him. And Scott Ritter's argument was that this made the elites in the country think, well, we're in with a chance. We might be able to make money out of the resources. Whereas Ritter said, if they'd actually said, no, there's no way we'll ever do a deal. And he says the same thing's happening with Iran. So it's interesting that one of the things that happened in Russia was that a lot of people made a huge amount of money, or let's say a few people made a huge amount of money
Very few
out of selling off all the assets. And there is a theory that that's what's happening in the States, that everything is up for sale. And we know that's what happened to Greece when their economy collapsed, that the Chinese went in and bought the ports and various other things. So, yeah, the parasites will be looking for what the money they can make out of things. I agree with those comments.
Sure. Let me jump back in. Cindy comments, "We are the world's terrorist enforcer, controlled by the elephant in the room." Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Yeah.
And Simon Pierce says, "Overfitting analogies is dangerous. An interesting question is about lessons and their applicability, in my opinion." That's an interesting point. I mean, so of course, I think the point is to showcase certainly that the United States and the Soviet Union are not that far apart in how they operate. But obviously, everything has its own trajectory, and there have been a lot of efforts to prolong things in artificial ways. And so the analogies are not one-to-one, certainly, but you're absolutely right that what we're trying to do is focusing on this book to take the lessons and to see what can be applicable, what we can expect, and what we might be able to avoid by having our eyes open. And then there's a comment from Christine Mose. "The power of the state requires complete dependence. The small-scale farmer is an anathema to their system," going back to talking about agriculture. And she adds, "Homeland Security was the extrajudicial runaround the Constitution. Homeland Security HS equals SS." Yes, correct. I get it. Yeah, it's like our version of the SS. Yeah, great comments. Yeah.
And the other one, going back to the comment about ICE, is all the money that's being spent on them is money that's not going into public benefit in any way, shape or form. So that's the other thing with money. Where are these collapsing empires putting their investments, and what are they sort of doing to help the people? And, this is another point about what's happening now. Trump is very, very unpopular, but he's not turning around. He's still apparently pushing to get his ballroom, which has a bunker in it, and all of those type of things to spend more money. I read, and I don't know whether it's true, but there were 220,000 applicants for 22,000 ICE jobs, that people are very willing, because the incentives are so high, to work doing those jobs to support that type of work, which we would just wish would stop, obviously.
Yeah, it's such a polarizing issue here in America as well. I mean, it you can't help but think when you see something that is such a hot button issue, you can't help but think that it's been created on purpose. They want this. They want us at each other's throats and screaming about this. So are those really people who are being hired for these jobs, or are they kind of hired gun mercenaries wearing a particular uniform, doing a job that's actually beyond the job description? Who knows? I don't know. I just want to thank everybody who's joining in and for this great conversation. Christine says, are they opportunistic parasites or the architects of it all? Which is a great comment. Yeah.
I think we'll all have our own views about that. I think it's deliberate. I think it's a deliberate dismantling. And as you said, there are all sorts of different things in play. But what is interesting, because going back to the book, Orlov says that one of the things, and maybe even the greatest thing that created or contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, was that the myth was no longer viable. And that's where America and the Soviets were different. They had different myths. They were similar, that they are societies based on myth, But in Soviet, it was about equality and about how everybody would have, good housing, healthcare, education. I mean, a lot of it wasn't true. The standard of living was pretty low, but it had been diabolical before. So, they raised standard of living for some people, but they didn't improve it over the years. I mean, he said that they did nothing on consumer goods whatsoever, and that created dissatisfaction. But it was when people stopped believing the myth, when they saw that there was an elite class, that there wasn't equality for everybody, then they started to sort of turn their back on the whole sort of infrastructure of government and how people were kept in fear and how the system worked. And I'm viewing what's happening in America from the UK, and obviously we've got our own things going on here. But I'm wondering how much the myth of America and government and belief in government and systems and law and order is really being challenged now.
Yeah, the question of the two competing myths is a really fascinating one that Orlov brings up in the book. Before we jump in too deep there, I just want to recognize a great comment from Mark Hobner. Where are our voices to change the momentum of $1.5 trillion in military commitments? And I think he makes a really good point, and a point that I've been hearing from others who are saying, we recognize what's going on. We know collapse is here, or things are only getting worse. But some people are asking why aren't we seeing more people out in the streets, young people? But again, I think that all of this is because it's so highly controlled. We are seeing obviously protests, but at I want to say smaller scale, but more targeted scale. So obviously there are people in the streets opposing the ICE raids, and this is the big news story right now happening in Minnesota. But large scale opposition to the entire myth, the entire institutional failure, we're not seeing that. We're seeing these targeted, isolated, kind of picking off one piece at a time and saying, I oppose that. And I'm not sure what it would take. I think that the culture has really changed from the days of the 1960s when young people were opposing war and opposing the government, to where we are now. I don't know why it has changed like that, but I think it's a really interesting question. And Mark, if you have further thoughts, please let us know. We'd love to drill down on that a little bit more. Here's Christine Mose. Again, the daycare scam is a template and the rule, not the exception. They grease palms and fund the black ops. And then Mark Petrie again says, in a full-on collapse scenario, foraging skills will be necessary for survival. One should focus on primitive skill sets, i.e. hunting without modern firearms. So another fantastic point, and maybe one that we'll talk a little bit more about next week when we talk about resistance in all its forms and preparation. But yeah, wonderful, wonderful comments. Thanks, everyone. This is great. Just going back to what we were talking about a second ago, the two myths that Orlov points out in his book when he's talking about the similarities and the differences. Basically, he says, the Soviet Union was built around the myth of a classless society. And the United States was built around the myth of a middle-class society. And those ideologies last as long as they are delivering a decent quality of life to people. And as soon as that starts to break down, the myth starts to fall apart. So the Soviet model started to fail when it was clear to people that it couldn't keep up. The American myth is failing differently because living standards are so the disparity is great and people are feeling the constraints, but the myth, it was built differently. And so, wealth is concentrated at the top, but the American dream tells people that all they have to do is just work harder, put in more effort, and you can climb that ladder and you can get up to the top and have some of that share of that wealth. And so it's hard, it's a harder myth to break because it puts the responsibility on the person rather than the system. I thought that he brought up a really interesting psychological experiment there to dive into and to think about a little bit, because even now I think there is this persistent sense that the American dream can still be achieved if only I just work a little harder, put in a little more.
Yeah, he actually makes the point, which I think is an excellent one to follow on from what you've just said, Zahra, is that people take it as a personal failure. So it wasn't that the myth was wrong or fabricated and totally illusionary. It was the fact that I just didn't do it well enough. I didn't work hard. I didn't have the lucky breaks or whatever. Mm-hmm. So psychologically, I think that's a big difference in terms of what's happening. And that's probably part of the reason we're seeing so much mental health problems and things. But yeah, this whole myth being exploded in different ways. And I was talking to somebody earlier today who works with young people. And I think there are, when you have sort of seminal points about how the myth gets challenged. And I think for a lot of people, what happened during the COVID scam was that they started to question because of what they were being told and following the science and the propaganda that went with it. And they started to question some of that. Yeah. And she was saying she's been following the Charlie Kirk thing, which surprised me for somebody in the UK, because she said over 300 hours. I said, why did you do that? She said, well, I teach young people, and it's been a momentous event for them to see something on film, somebody being assassinated. And for a lot of them, they've started to question what's going on in the world and, what to believe. And so various things are happening in such a fast pace. But in some ways, are they chipping away at these myths? That America's all powerful, that they're the good guys. I mean, we have that myth in the UK that we go in and help people, and now we no longer believe that, because we've seen that what we actually do is supply the armaments and the intelligence services, and we bomb children and women and buildings and leave people there. And then we have the audacity to put the people who did that in charge of the peace process. Yeah, it's so mad that it must be hard to still keep believing the mythology and the propaganda that's being put out there. But obviously some people still do.
Well, for a lot of people, certainly in past generations, the American dream became a reality. And so a lot of people could see that and still have hope that they could join the elite, or they could at least move their station from point A to point B. Because a lot of people did. I mean, generations of people did. So we call it a myth now, but it was called the American dream for a reason. And people could actually think of themselves differently within that system and give themselves some confidence and some personal agency and work hard and succeed. The ceilings that they have met, the brick walls that they've now run against as generations have moved on, are the problem, obviously. But it's interesting to think, of course, all of these things were happening before as well. The idea that a generation of people would witness a galvanizing event is not new. There was the John F. Kennedy assassination for that generation in the 1960s, and then fast forward to 9/11, and the entire world witnessed the attack on the Twin Towers. And now Charlie Kirk is 25 years on from that. I think, again, that these things sometimes happen for a reason. And this is something that you and I have discussed often, and we always question the motives behind it. But it's interesting. It's also extremely polarizing, and it's one where we don't know the truth, and we might never know the truth. And it gets people riled up, and we all have to be aware that is happening. I think we have to shield ourselves from getting riled up in the wrong way. I mean, we're allowed to have emotional reactions to things. I'm not saying that, but we should also be alert to the fact that we may be manipulated.
We are being manipulated, and I think you're right in terms of just sort of recognizing that. And the reason to bring it up in this conversation is, are they accelerating collapse?
Yeah.
Regardless of whether they're true or not true, but the whole sort of fabric of trust that holds societies together, that we all work on a sort of basis of that. And one of the myths, so I think you're right, I think perhaps and you'll know better than me, but the American dream myth might still continue a bit further. But one of the myths that's certainly going in the UK is that our government will take care of us. We've been brought up with a national health system, with a free education system, and often called the nanny state. But now that's changing quite considerably. So that myth is losing its power. And once people start to sort of question, well, what is the purpose of government? Ours is now saying that we need an economy based on this military spending, which Orlov says is very indicative of a collapsing state. And even Spengler and people like, if we're looking for patterns in collapse, then, going to war over resources is a sign of an empire in its dying days. It's in decline, and it's desperate to keep going.
Yeah.
So, we put all of these things in with the collapse perspective. And I think the one that Orlov said, because you don't hear a lot of people talk about that, myth is actually a part of the collapse scenario and patterns that we should be looking at.
Yeah. One of the things, if I paraphrase something that he wrote, one of the things that he said is that the Soviet Union collapsed because it couldn't hide its failures. And the United States is trying to survive, or at least prolong collapse, by endlessly reframing those failures and redefining what the intention was and what the outcome was. And we all know, I think, certainly over the last 5 years, how blurring that has become and how confusing it is for a lot of people. Maybe not for us who are now on this call, because our eyes are open in many ways, but for a lot of people, for the average person that you meet on the street, it's overwhelming and confusing and hard to parse through. You don't know who to trust. You can't really trust, and you just sort of resign yourself to, I have other things I need to think about today, just in terms of survival and well-being. And so I'm not even going to put any mental energy into figuring out what's going on and who's behind it all. And so I really do feel like that's kind of where we're at. And I want to jump back over to the comments. We're getting great interaction. So thank you, everyone. Mark Hobner said, again, most people don't know or can't picture what a million, billion, trillion of anything looks like. So the long-term impacts of spending are becoming apparent, but we're not connecting those dots. And I think that's a really important point. And nothing shows that more than the debt numbers, which are so astronomical and so exponentially fast in how they're growing. I don't think any of us can really wrap our head around what that means. 34 trillion. I mean, what does that even look like, and how could it ever be fixed? I think it's such an astronomical number, and it becomes so abstract that it's hard for people to push back on it. There's a small subset of people who understand it well and who are doing a great job of trying to communicate the horrors and the dangers, but a lot of people just tune out because it's just too hard to understand the arithmetic of it. So thank you for that comment, Mark, and please keep them coming. We're we're jumping around because the conversation is very wide ranging. Christine Mose said the levers of control manage the hamster wheel of subsistence living. The dollar bill, fiat currency, is the slave token, the ultimate control system. Wow, we'd love to hear a little more, Christine, on what your thoughts are on that, because you know, a lot of people think of subsistence living as the path out of what's to come. So if you're suggesting that that's also a hamster wheel that we won't be able to get off of, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that. Yeah.
With universal income, that's one of the arguments, isn't it? And when we go over to digital control and all of those things.
Yeah. Again, Matthew Kerr-Lewis says in January 2025, ICE had roughly 10,000 officers and approximately 40,000 detention beds. 12 months later, ICE has over 22,000 officers and 66,000 detention beds, with contracts in place for 107,000 by the end of January. Internal documents project 116,000 beds by spring. For context, the entire federal prison system holds approximately 155,000 people. So yeah, going back to the idea of an incarceration state, these numbers are pretty chilling. Matthew continues, so this isn't happening by accident. Who are the kinds of people they're planning to put in there? Right, that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and it's American taxpayers who are paying for that. And it's money that's not going on other infrastructure or support or medical aid or any of those things. It's devastating. Yeah, it's massive amounts of money.
Chilling. I think what Matthew is suggesting is now it's people who are illegally in this country, but who will it be tomorrow or next week? It could be people who are legally in this country, but who said something on social media that the government doesn't like. And the infrastructure will be there for whoever they want to round up and put in there. So yeah, that's a very frightening thought. But putting those dots together is really important, as appalling as it seems. Mark Hobner says, going back to the idea of the young people who have been galvanized by Charlie Kirk, would those same young people be more appalled at the assassinations of 300 defenders of planet every year over the last 20 years because they are simply obstacles to profit? How can we mobilize these realizations?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's, it's who gets promoted, what gets promoted, what things are we told to be horrified about, and which things just get glossed over and normalized. And I think that's part of what we're trying to deal with. And for those of us who've been interested in this sort of empires and collapse and how that will affect our lives, I certainly know I never thought it would be about how do I live in authoritarianism and tyranny and, different threats that are coming from our own, certainly from my government, and I don't know how people feel about it in the States, but that wasn't something I factored in. It was about how to grow your own food and how to build your local community. And still as relevant, even more so relevant, because the odds are even more stacked against us because those sort of things are being deliberately dismantled. And, one of the things I liked about in the book that Orlov said, because I'm looking forward to next week when we talk about resistance, because I think it's such a valuable question about how do we live with what's going on now. So the Soviet people seemed to comply as much as they possibly could to get by, but they found ways to work around the system. And I think that was one of the strengths for them when it collapsed. They'd already got a black market system. Right. They had already traded food, and they had people, you said what their name was last week, Zahra, I can't remember, who were traders. So this whole thing about, it didn't become Mad Max, but it got very tough, and they had their own mafia. They had the Chechen mafia and probably every crook in the book. Yeah, trying to do various things and locked kiosks and stuff. But there was this whole new merchant class that actually rose up, and that's one of the things he sort of advises. Is there are certain things that are more valuable than money, and in Russia it was alcohol and designer clothes. that you could get fuel if you could trade those, whereas the ruble was worth nothing. It was
nobody wanted it.
In Germany, or Greece, where you had to give like a gold sovereign to get a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
So those are some sort of practical things, because we can't all go out foraging, but we might have things which are tradable. And to step into that void of when people can't get goods, people will still want things.
This is a really interesting one, and we can go into this more next week and probably spend a long time on it, because there are so many models. We have a friend, a person that we know through Substack, Fabian Omar, who grew up in Brazil and talked about changes there. And very similarly, there quickly springs up this black market or gray market where you can get things done based on who you know. But all of these examples pale in comparison to the world that we're in now. And I think this is perhaps what Christine was alluding to. She said a system will be perfected by digital ID and the surveillance state. So what we're in now, just being able to grow a victory garden is not going to protect you from a global surveillance grid that is watching us all the time. Digital IDs in order to be able to move anywhere outside of your front door or even within your walls. I mean, we are living in this technological nightmare world that didn't exist in past examples of collapse or breakdown of society. And we don't really know, other than the sci-fi novels that were written 100 years ago, we don't really know what that's going to be like. We certainly see a lot of echoes in books like 1984 of what it might be like. But in reality, there are things that I'm not really sure we understand how to protect against or how to work around. And we may not know until we get thrown into it and we just have to roll with it. But I'd love to hear other people's thoughts in that regard. We have a few more comments, which is great, related to Matthew's comment, the poem, which I think we all know, but it's always worth repeating. The poem by Pastor Martin Niemöller. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. It's every single time I hear or read that, I get goosebumps. It's absolutely chilling and relevant.
Very relevant to our conversation, which we keep referring to. And we're so tempted to go into it about resistance, because that is like so spot on, isn't it? And that's why I'm amazed at the courage of people who are going out there to protect their neighbours. And, going back to your point, Zahra, about we haven't got a digital grid yet. I think we have to work on the basis that there's still things that we can do. And I see, and that's a big difference from what I see happening in America and what's happening in the UK. In America, you have got ICE, and it's doing what it's doing, but it's like a wake-up call, and it's bringing a lot of people out to practice mutual aid, support, help, and unifying people in a lot of ways. And I think that is encouraging and hopeful, because those are all the things that we will need in a collapse.
Yeah.
That we're there already thinking about our neighbours and doing what we can to look after them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we don't have that in the UK. We don't have that to rally around. I'm not saying we want it, because we don't, but it's more undercover. It's more, there's just not so many things going on. And I feel we're sleepwalking. I think America's going through shock tactics. We're sleepwalking through. And that's a big difference.
Yeah. And I think, again, all of that might be by design. Allison noted, we haven't had a technological surveillance state before now. I just really hope we can survive like others before us. But I want to then jump back up to Christine's comment, which I think echoes it and does have a little bit more of a hopeful note. We can't avoid the collapse. That is inevitable, she says. Study the nature of how to survive in a collapsed environment. Align with nature and abundance flows. Subsistence living is a suppression of power to manage the population just at the poverty level. The system of scarcity is the opposite of nature. So I think that's a lovely sentiment. We don't, I guess we need to distinguish between subsistence living, which is just scraping by, and being self-sufficient, being able to rely on ourselves and the small community of people around us to be able to live in abundance, even if that abundance doesn't mean cheap plastic goods from the dollar store, but abundance in the things that nature provides for us. So any thoughts, Susan, on Christine's comment? And Christine, please keep them coming, because you've got some
keep them coming. They're great comments, and nice to include all of these in the conversation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think she's right. I mean, and I don't have, again, the data, but various things that I've read, there's enough food in the world. It's just we have people who distribute it and use it and weaponize it and decide who gets food and who doesn't, and who pays more for it and what people eat. And in an ideal world, we would be combining resources and sending them when they're needed. And there's no reason why we couldn't all have food and shelter. You know, if we look at, as we say, trillions, I never understand all these trillions and trillions of dollars. And, you know, we had one in the UK where it was a great triumph. They were going to do something around the second child allowance. And they reckon that there were 445,000 such children in the UK who would be getting more money. And they were spending 5 billion on the scheme. Well, you only have to look at it and think, well, how can you spend 5 billion on 500,000 children? How do you justify that? What are you actually doing? Would it be better just to give them the money? All of this, they're all money laundering. They're all scamming and creaming money off the top, aren't they? And same with the military industrial complex, because that was the other argument that Orlov put forward, is that both empires needed an enemy. Because without an enemy, you cannot justify that mammoth spending. And they're all looking at spending even more on that. And the madness that at this stage of our evolution as a species, that we're still trying to kill each other as a way of dealing with disputes. You know, these are some of the things that are being challenged. And I don't have the answers, but I think there's such a big intention now to challenge those things and come up with better ways as human beings to live with each other.
Yeah. Christine has another wonderful comment, but before that, Matthew Kerlewis says, unfortunately, I have to go, as in physically leave these premises, but thank you as always for a fascinating discussion. And thank you, Matthew, for joining and following along. We always enjoy your feedback and your comments. So have a wonderful rest of your day. And Christine has another amazing comment, picking up on what we were talking about. Self-sufficiency is everything, along with community. The state offers a free ride and the promise of safety, and most choose the latter. And that also picks up on another comment, which was that feeding at the trough is a sign of collapse. And this, I think, is so relevant, like just talking about that scheme that you were just mentioning. People get very easily seduced into the idea that the government will provide. They have all these schemes to help the people, to identify the vulnerable, to make sure that no one falls behind. And everybody wants to get in line for something that's supposedly free, instead of actually spending the same amount of time and energy and resources building up their own self-sufficiency. And at some point, those resources, whether they exist at all, for these schemes will run out. But a lot of the times, these are just political plays. We promise to give you something, but then, something happened, or we had a meeting and we've changed the rules of the game. And so it's not 500,000 children and it's not 5 billion pounds. We've actually scaled it back to, a very limited amount, and nobody gets what they were promised. Instead, people should really be focusing on how they can do things for themselves, how they can build a group of people around them who will be able to help each other in mutually beneficial ways. It's very hard, though. It's hard to change that mindset. It's hard to find those people. It's hard to know who to trust. And even sometimes it's hard for people to recognize that they even have skills that they can use themselves or share with others. Some people feel a bit helpless in all of this, I think.
And have been encouraged to be helpless. I mean, huge dependency that we now have on government and NGOs and institutions. And, the more independent we are from them, or from the medical system or the education system. And the other thing which struck me the other week is how many people are employed by the government.
Yeah.
If you look at like 100 years ago, there's this very small percentage of the population that was employed. But now we have teachers, we have, I don't know in America whether people like in the medical system are within industry, but in the UK, it's the biggest employer. I think it's the biggest employer in Europe is our National Health Service. So people are going to support the government because that's where their money comes from. They're employed by them.
Yes.
So are they going to challenge the status quo or question or, fight back, resist when their living is dependent on that?
100%, Susan. We saw that very clearly in Canada, unfortunately. The number that sticks out of my head in Canada is something like 40% of the population is employed by some level of government, whether it's federal or provincial or local. But that's a huge, incredible number. I mean, imagine for a country the size of Canada, that 40% of those people rely on the government for their income and also for so many other services, because that's the nature of Canadian society, that the government provides the services. It also provides at the provincial level the liquor store and now the cannabis store. And so it's true that people are much more reluctant to not even speak out, but even to frame the thoughts around how the government might not be on your side. The government might not be providing all the things that it should be providing, because your entire existence is dependent on believing that it is benevolent, that it is efficient, that it is fulfilling their side of the contractual agreement. And if you start to question that, you start to oppose it, everything in your life starts to fall apart very quickly. It becomes very scary. And then, of course, when the trucker convoy happened, in Ottawa during COVID, many people will remember that was very swiftly and very brutally dealt with. And so it's even for those people who were able to jump outside of that and say, no, this needs to stop. When you have a crackdown like that, it's going to really stop people from having that feeling again. So yeah, I think that's a really tough one to deal with. I just want to, there are a couple more comments, but there was a lovely one from Christine here. I just want to go back to, where she said, I've never felt so loved delivering hard truth bombs. So I thought that was very sweet. But yeah, Christine, you're in the right place. Thank you. Keep them coming. Keep them coming.
You're in good company.
Absolutely. Then we have Pat Brown says he or she despise the terms sustainability and self-sufficiency since they're co-opted use by corporations to fool people into non-movement. It's better to think communal resiliency. I spent 20 years developing the aquaponic growing 11,000 gallon rain catchment. Visitors will invariably say, I'll just come here when things go bad. until I tell them I can sleep 40, but you'll need to compost your own poo.
Yeah, put the link in, not about the poo, but in where you are and what you're doing, and share it with us, because it's so good to hear about things like that. And even the word resiliency. I read an article earlier today, somebody talking about bushfires that destroyed their farm in Australia, and they got fed up with government people coming around talking, the words that were taken over, the resiliency and community and all various things which just rang so hollow. But that's part of what the empire does, isn't it? It usurps things which are valuable and useful, and turns it for their own good, all behaving ourselves for the good of other people, and not killing off granny, and being green and recycling, as if that's going to make a big difference.
Yeah.
It's all part of it, isn't it? And the other one I wanted to just go back to, just because it's mentioned in the book, which I thought was really interesting, about all the government jobs. What happened in the Soviet is they stopped paying them. There was no money, and people's savings got wiped out. And so people were still going into work because there was a canteen going, so. Or was it that they just couldn't believe that and I've heard that in various places, that people will still keep going to work because there are some perks left. But eventually you've got to face it, that there's no money coming in, that the government is bankrupt. And what happens when it can't pay wages? You've had that situation in the States, haven't you, sometimes?
Yeah, there have been government shutdowns where all the government workers didn't get paid until the government reopens. And that just happened a few months ago. And there was a big concern that people wouldn't be receiving their food stamps because of the government shutdown, and what might happen if people don't get those benefits. And so, yeah, it's highly precarious. There, just to pick up on that, there was an anecdote that Dmitry Orlov wrote in the book about a time when he went back to the Soviet Union, I believe on a business trip. And I don't remember what kind of institute. I think it was an institute, maybe a think tank or a scientific institute that he was going to visit. And when he arrived there and found the people that he was there to meet, they said, "Oh, we're really sorry, you just missed lunch," which I think is the point you were just making, that the big highlight of the day is that they had a canteen that provided them with a hot meal, and they were so apologetic that he had missed that moment, because that's it. When lunch hour is done, that's it. There's no more chance to get that meal. But yeah, this goes back to we mentioned it last week as well. But the old saying in the Soviet Union was, "We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us." It was just theater, and that is really very much, I feel like, where we're at here in the United States with so many things, so many of our institutional behaviors are just theater. Democracy itself is just theater. It's just pretense. And a lot of people are getting pulled into being actors in that play without realizing that it really is just a play. And then you get orchestrated, the director kind of moves you around on the stage and tells you what to say and what to think and what to feel. And we need to actually start pulling back and realizing that it's all artifice, it's performative.
But that's scary. That's really scary. And we don't want to end on a scary note, but it is part of, just a reminder of what we have said today, and then talk about what we're going to cover next week. So one of the things from the Orlov book is to be as independent as possible. However you choose to do that, that might be because you have good connections with food producers, people who are good tradespeople, and that you think about what your tradables would be. And that could be skills that you've already got, skills that you're going to acquire to make you useful. Those sort of things are part of the security. And I think those are really good lessons that we can take from this book.
Absolutely.
Being independent, you know, being ready to make cakes at the station. That was one of the things, wasn't it? People getting up early, and there were no cafes. So people just had to buy from traders, like in India, where the train stops. All of those things, which do seem like, when life's going on as normal, really strange. But they are the type of thing that if you're already thinking about how might you do that using your imagination, because that was another Orlov thing, that he thought collapse was a result of lack of imagination. People couldn't imagine that the system would ever end. And they couldn't imagine what would replace it. And that's the whole thing about being creative now and imagining what we've put in place and creating that now. So it's there, ready. It's not a void which will be filled by other people who don't have our good intentions towards
Absolutely.
us.
Yeah. I think, Pat, if you're able to join us next week, it would be great, because I think the idea that self-sufficiency or even independence is not the ultimate goal. I think we need to be able to have our own skills and rely on each other. But Susan, everything you just laid out there requires other people. You know, we need other people to help us, to trade with, to communicate with. And so there is this really important sense of connectedness, and the communal resilience that Pat brought up, I think will be a really important part of our discussion next week. And, you know, building skills and becoming strong for the sake of others as well. So I think this is a good place to start closing down, just to say thank you so much to everybody. And just to close out some of these comments, we asked Pat where he or she was based, and I'm in Ventura County, California. Christine Mose says the Humanure Handbook, highly recommended. And to the point about being paid by the government or being reliant on the government, Allison said, whoopsie, government shutdown. So yeah, absolutely. We've already lived through that, we know. Yeah, so everybody, thank you so much. This has been just an incredible conversation with really good interaction, and we're so grateful that you spent this time with us. We will be back the same time next week. We'll continue this conversation. And Susan, enjoy the rest of your travels, and be well. Have a great week.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It's been such a joy to have you join us and enter into the conversation. I look forward to more next week.
Me too. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.